I still remember the exact words she used, because they were delivered with the kind of confidence that only comes from someone who has never been challenged before. "You're going to need to stop whatever you're planning out here. This shoreline belongs to the community during the Harvest Bass Classic, and interfering with an official association event could leave you legally responsible." She stood there in a pressed navy blazer, holding a leather binder against her hip like it was some kind of badge, while behind her half a dozen bass boats floated quietly across the water my grandfather had spent most of his life protecting. The strange part wasn't that she believed every word she was saying. The strange part was that she was standing on land my family had owned for nearly 70 years, and she had absolutely no idea. Before I tell you what happened next, let me ask you something. Have you ever had somebody walk into your life and tell you that something you worked your whole life for somehow belonged to them now? Because until that October morning, I honestly believed stories like that only happened on television. My name is Ethan Mercer. I'm 54 years old, and I live in the rolling hills outside Briar Ridge, Kentucky, where mornings begin with fog drifting over the water and evenings end with tree frogs singing louder than most radios. My grandfather, Samuel Mercer, used to say that if you wanted to understand a piece of land, you had to spend enough quiet mornings on it that the birds stopped noticing you were there. I grew up believing that. I probably still do. Granddad wasn't wealthy. He never drove a fancy truck, never wore expensive boots, never talked about success the way people do now. Success to him was paying cash whenever he could, sleeping well at night, and never owing another man an apology for how he earned his living. He bought his first section of land after 12 years cutting timber all across eastern Kentucky. Every winter he'd disappear into the mountains with a crew, then come home with another little piece of property whenever he could afford it. Acre after acre, year after year, until one day all those little purchases became one continuous stretch of nearly 4,000 acres. People around here call it Mercer Hollow. To me, it was simply home. There were 3 lakes scattered across the property. North Lake sat beneath a limestone bluff where bald eagles sometimes nested. Willow Lake was shallow and surrounded by old cypress trees that turned gold every fall. Then there was Blackwater Pond, the deepest of the 3, where my grandfather swore bass older than I was still hid beneath submerged cedar trunks. Maybe he exaggerated a little. Grandfathers tend to do that. But every once in a while somebody hooked something down there that made you wonder if maybe he wasn't exaggerating after all. When Granddad passed away, the property went to my father. When Dad died 15 years later, it came to me. Along with the land came a simple promise every Mercer man had made for 3 generations. Don't carve it up. Don't sell it because somebody waves enough money in your face. And never let anyone convince you that paperwork matters less than memories. At the time, I thought he was talking about greedy developers. Turns out he was talking about something much stranger. About 15 years ago, a subdivision called Pine Creek Estates was built along the western edge of our property. Nice homes. Brick entrances, decorative streetlights, families raising kids. Honestly, I never had a problem with any of them. I'd wave if I saw someone walking near the fence line. Sometimes I'd even help pull a car out of the ditch after heavy rain. They seemed like decent folks. The only people I never really got to know were the board members running their homeowners association, especially the president. Her name was Victoria Langford. If you've ever met someone who mistakes confidence for authority, you already know the type. Everything had rules. Everything required permission. Everything needed a committee. Over the years, I'd hear little stories around town. Somebody painted their mailbox the wrong shade of white. Somebody parked a camper too long in the driveway. Somebody planted flowers that weren't approved by the landscaping committee. I'd laugh and go back to fixing fences because none of it had anything to do with me. At least, that's what I thought. It started with my neighbor, Walter Hayes. Walter had been ranching cattle beside us since Jimmy Carter was president. He wasn't much for gossip. If Walter drove over unexpectedly, there was usually a reason. One afternoon, he climbed out of his pickup carrying a folded newsletter. "You might want to look at this." That was all he said. I unfolded the paper while we stood beside the tailgate. Across the top, in cheerful green lettering, it read, "Fourth Annual Pine Creek Community Bass Tournament." I smiled for about 2 seconds, then I noticed the map. There they were: North Lake, Willow Lake, Blackwater Pond, every one of them labeled as community recreation waters. I actually laughed, not because it was funny, because my brain refused to believe what my eyes were seeing. Walter scratched his beard and finally spoke. "You seeing what I'm seeing?" "I sure hope not." He shook his head slowly. "They've been fishing out there for a couple years now." That sentence hit me harder than the newsletter. "What do you mean, a couple years?" "You really didn't know?" I hadn't. I rarely used the Western Trails anymore. My work usually kept me on the eastern side checking fences, managing timber crews, repairing culverts after storms. There were entire corners of the property I might not visit for months at a time. Apparently, somebody else had been making very good use of that fact. The next morning, I drove my old Ford out toward the western boundary before sunrise. At first, everything looked normal. The fence was still there. The cedar trees still lined the ridge. Then I rounded one bend and stopped. Someone had cut a 40-foot opening through my fence. There was a steel gate, fresh gravel, tire tracks, a wooden sign painted forest green. Pine Creek ESTATES Private Lake Access Members only. I climbed out of the truck and just stared at it for a while. It's funny what your brain notices in moments like that. Not the anger, not even the trespassing. What bothered me most was how carefully they'd built everything. Concrete footings, pressure-treated posts, professionally pawed boat ramp, thousands of dollars worth of work. Nobody builds something like that overnight, which meant dozens of people, contractors, board members, volunteers. Every single one of them had spent months improving property that didn't belong to them. And somehow, not one person had bothered checking who actually owned the land, or maybe they had. Maybe they simply assumed no one would ever challenge them. Standing there beside that sign, I felt something my grandfather used to describe as cold anger. Not loud anger, not explosive anger. The kind that slows your breathing because your mind has already started planning instead of reacting. I reached into my truck, grabbed my camera, and began taking photographs. Every fence post, every tire mark, every bolt holding that sign together, every inch of that boat ramp. I even photographed the old survey marker my father and I had uncovered years earlier after a brush fire swept through that section of woods. Then I drove home, made a pot of coffee, spread every document I owned across my kitchen table. And before noon, I made one phone call that would quietly begin unraveling everything Pine Creek Estates believed they knew. If you've ever been told that paperwork doesn't matter, wait until you hear what happened after my attorney opened the county records. The lawyer I called that morning wasn't someone I knew well. His name was Daniel Brooks, and he'd spent most of his career handling land disputes, easement issues, and title problems throughout eastern Kentucky. A mutual friend had recommended him years earlier after settling a messy boundary disagreement between two neighboring farms, and everyone seemed to describe him the same way. He wasn't flashy. He wasn't the kind of attorney who made dramatic speeches. He simply liked facts more than opinions. When he answered the phone, I explained what I'd found. There was a pause. "Do you have your deed?" "I've got 3 copies." "Did you ever sign an easement, recreational agreement, access permit?" "Anything involving Pine Creek Estates?" "No, Another pause. Good. I wasn't expecting that answer. Good. Because if what you're telling me is accurate, I don't want you touching a single thing out there. What about the gate? Leave it. The sign? Leave it. The boat ramp? Absolutely leave it. I leaned back in my chair. So I just let them keep using it. For another couple of weeks if necessary. Yes. That wasn't the answer I wanted. Daniel must have heard it in my silence because he chuckled. Ethan, angry property owners destroy evidence every single year. You're not going to be one of them. I looked out the kitchen window toward the tree line. So what do? We let the paperwork do the talking. Those words stayed with me. The paperwork. Not emotions, not arguments, not assumptions, just paperwork. By the following afternoon, Daniel had already requested a complete title search from the county recorder's office, along with every recorded document affecting the western boundary of Mercer Hollow. Meanwhile, life outside my kitchen kept moving. The tournament preparations continued. Every evening I could hear truck doors closing near the western entrance, generators humming, people laughing, bass boats launching into water they had absolutely no right to use. Part of me wanted to drive over there and throw every one of them out. Another part remembered my father's voice. Never start a fight when the law can finish it for you. About a week later, the first certified letter arrived. The return address carried the Pine Creek Estates Homeowners Association logo across the top. Victoria Langford had signed it herself. The letter informed me that several residents had reported my attempts to interfere with established community recreational access. Attempts. I hadn't spoken to a single resident. According to the letter, the lakes had become recognized community amenities over several years of continuous use, and any effort to restrict access could expose me to legal consequences. I read it twice. Then I laughed, not because it was ridiculous, because there wasn't a single piece of evidence attached. No survey, no recorded easement, no deed, no agreement, just confidence typed onto expensive letterhead. I slipped the letter into a folder Daniel had asked me to keep. He told me something interesting during our first meeting. People who know they're right usually send documents. People who think they're right usually send opinions. That distinction was beginning to make a lot more sense. 10 days later, another envelope showed up. This one came from a law firm in Lexington representing the association. The language sounded much more intimidating. It demanded that I stop threatening community access. It instructed me not to install locks or barriers. It warned me against communicating with residents about ownership. The funny thing was, I hadn't done any of those things. I had taken photographs. I had organized paperwork. I had hired an attorney. That was it. Daniel smiled when he finished reading the letter. This just keeps getting better. It doesn't feel better. It will. How? They've now committed themselves to a legal position in writing. I wasn't following. They've officially claimed rights they now have to prove. 3 days later, the county records finally arrived. Daniel invited me to his office instead of discussing them over the phone. That should have been my first clue. Stacks of plats, surveys, title abstracts, and recorded deeds covered the conference table. He slid one document toward me. Start here. It was the original chain of title going back almost 70 years. Every transfer, every survey, every recorded change, every mortgage that had been satisfied decades earlier, everything. Nothing referenced Pine Creek Estates. Nothing referenced recreational access. Nothing referenced an easement. Nothing. Daniel reached for another folder. This is every document filed since the subdivision was approved. Again, nothing. No agreement. No license. No shared use covenant. No public access grant. Not even a conversation preserved in writing. He looked up at me. Ethan. Yeah, they built an entrance. I know. They poured a concrete launch. I saw it. They've been collecting tournament fees. I've got the newsletters, and according to every public record in this county, He tapped the title report with one finger. They had absolutely no legal authority to do any of it. For a moment, neither of us spoke. It felt strangely quiet. Almost disappointing. I'd spent 2 weeks preparing for some complicated legal mystery. Instead, the answer was painfully simple. Someone had assumed. Then someone else assumed the first person had checked. Then another person assumed everything was legitimate because expensive improvements were already there. Assumptions piled on assumptions until they somehow became accepted as fact. Daniel finally broke the silence. "We are filing." The complaint moved quickly. Trespass. Quiet title. Permanent injunction. Recovery of commercial profits earned from unauthorized use. When I saw that last line, I looked across his desk. "You can actually ask for that. They charged entry fees on your property." "They did. They sold sponsorships. I've seen the banners. They awarded prize money. Every fall." He smiled. "Then let's calculate exactly how much your land earned for somebody else." Over the next several days, we gathered everything, every newsletter, every registration form we could obtain, every photograph I'd taken, old survey maps, drone images, tax records, property assessments, even archived social media posts showing smiling tournament winners posing beside my lake with giant checks held over their heads. The total came to just over $16,000 in entry fees alone. That didn't include sponsorship money, or merchandise, or concessions. The more we uncovered, the stranger the entire situation became, not because anyone had hidden it, because no one ever imagined they'd need to. People had posted photos publicly for years. Families smiled beside signs that literally stood on my shoreline. Board members congratulated themselves online for improving community property. Every picture felt like another page of evidence. Then, about 2 weeks before the hearing, I finally met Victoria Langford face to face. She drove onto my property in a white SUV and walked toward my porch with that same leather binder tucked beneath her arm. She didn't smile. Neither did I. She stopped a few feet away. "You still have time to resolve this privately." "I thought that's what the court was for." Her expression tightened. "You've created unnecessary conflict." I looked past her toward the hills where my grandfather had planted cedar seedlings decades ago. "No, Victoria," I met her eyes. "I think somebody else created it." She folded her arms. "Our residents genuinely believe those lakes belong to the community." I nodded slowly. "I actually believe they do." For the first time, she looked confused. "You do?" "I believe they honestly think that." She waited. "The problem is," I said quietly, "the county recorder doesn't care what anyone believes." She didn't answer. She simply turned, climbed back into her SUV, and drove away. That was the last conversation we ever had before the courtroom, and somehow, it told me exactly how the hearing was going to end. The courthouse didn't look like the kind of place where life-changing moments happened. It was a modest brick building with creaky wooden floors, faded benches polished by decades of nervous hands, and old windows that let in soft winter light. If you drove past it too quickly, you'd probably mistake it for an old library. But on that February morning, it felt like the center of my entire world. Daniel arrived carrying 2 banker boxes filled with documents. I walked in carrying nothing but a legal pad and a cup of coffee that had already gone cold. Victoria Langford sat across the aisle with 2 attorneys. She looked just as confident as the day she'd stood beside my lake. If she felt any uncertainty, she hid it well. When the judge entered, everyone stood. There wasn't much ceremony after that. The judge had clearly spent time reviewing the filings before we ever stepped into the courtroom. The association's attorney spoke first. He talked about community expectations, shared traditions, years of peaceful use, residents who had come to believe the lakes belonged to everyone. He spoke for nearly 20 minutes. When he finished, the judge leaned forward slightly and asked one simple question. Can you identify the recorded instrument that grants your client legal access to Mr. Mercer's property? The attorney looked down at his notes. He shuffled a few papers. Finally, he answered, "No, Your Honor." The courtroom became so quiet I could hear someone coughing in the hallway. The judge nodded once. "Very well." Daniel stood. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't pace. He simply walked through the evidence one piece at a time: the original deed, the county survey, the chain of title, the aerial photographs. The photographs I had taken of the gate, the boat ramp, and the sign. Copies of every newsletter advertising tournaments on my property. Financial records showing entry fees collected over 4 consecutive years. Every document fit together like pieces of a puzzle. No drama, no theatrics, just facts. At one point, Daniel paused and looked toward the judge. "Property rights are not established by repetition. They are established by law." That sentence stayed with me long after everything else faded. The judge reviewed her notes for several minutes before speaking. Her decision was calm, direct, and impossible to misunderstand. The association had no legal right to use Mercer Hollow. No recorded easement existed. No access agreement had ever been granted. Every improvement built beyond my boundary fence had been constructed without permission. The association was ordered to remove the entrance gate, boat ramp, signage, and every other improvement within 60 days. They were ordered to restore the property to its previous condition. They were ordered to compensate me for the commercial use of my land, reimburse court costs, and pay additional damages resulting from willful trespass after receiving notice of ownership. Nobody celebrated, not even Daniel. He simply closed his folder, leaned over, and whispered, "I think your grandfather would approve." I swallowed hard. Yeah, I think he would. Across the courtroom, Victoria remained perfectly still. The confidence that had surrounded her for months hadn't exploded. It had simply disappeared. Sometimes that's how reality works. It doesn't embarrass you. It just quietly replaces certainty with truth. Over the next several weeks, I watched construction crews remove everything they'd built. The steel gate disappeared first. Then the wooden sign. The concrete launch ramp took the longest. Jackhammers echoed across the lake for 2 full days before the shoreline finally looked the way I remembered it. When the last truck pulled away, I spent an entire Saturday rebuilding the fence with cedar posts I'd been saving in my barn for years. As I tamped the final post into the ground, I realized something that surprised me. I wasn't angry anymore. Winning hadn't given me satisfaction because someone else lost. It gave me peace because something broken had finally been repaired. A few months later, I heard that Pine Creek Estates elected a new board. Several homeowners reportedly had no idea the association had been spending their dues defending land it never owned. From what I was told, many of them weren't upset about losing access to the lakes. They were upset that nobody had verified the facts before spending thousands of dollars fighting a battle that never should have happened. Oddly enough, I don't blame most of those families. If you're told something often enough by people wearing titles, eventually you stop asking questions. That's true in neighborhoods, businesses, even governments. Authority sounds convincing. Documentation is convincing. Those two things are not always the same. These days, mornings at Mercer Hollow feel familiar again. The fog still settles across North Lake. The geese still arrive before sunrise. Every now and then I'll find fresh deer tracks near the shoreline and catch myself smiling for no particular reason. The land never cared about courtrooms. The trees never cared about lawsuits. They simply waited for people to finish arguing about something the records had already settled. My grandfather used to say that ownership isn't about shouting the loudest. It's about quietly keeping your promises long after everyone else has forgotten theirs. I understand that now better than I ever did growing up. If this experience taught me anything, it's this. Never assume that confidence equals truth. Never assume that a committee vote can replace a deed. And never ignore the value of good records, patient decisions, and knowing exactly what belongs to you before someone else decides it belongs to them. Now, I'd really like to hear what you think. Was the homeowners association simply careless, or did they cross a line the moment they built that first gate without verifying who owned the land? If you had been standing in my boots that morning, would you have confronted everyone immediately, or would you have done what I did and let the paperwork speak first? Share your thoughts down in the comments because these stories always spark strong opinions, and honestly, that's what makes the conversation worthwhile. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and stick around, because next time I'll tell you about the neighbor who built an entire garage 6 feet over the property line and believed he had every right to keep it.